This is an analysis of the German 2022 film All Quiet on the Western Front, which was distributed by Netflix. There are some story point spoilers in this analysis, so if you haven't seen the film or are familiar with the book, I'd suggest watching the film before you watch this analysis. I think you'll probably get more out of it anyway. Now, if you're familiar with the film, the things I'm going to talk about will make more sense. In the United States, it did win Best International Feature and Best Cinematography, Best Film Score, and Best Production Design. The film is based on a famous book, Westen Nichts Neues, which was translated in English as All Quiet on the Western Front. It's by a German writer named Erich Maria Remarque, who was a World War I veteran. The book came out in 1928. It was immediately a worldwide sensation. Though in Europe, in many of the European countries, it was actually banned, in some until the 1960s, for being too pacifistic. And then when the Nazis came to power in Germany, in fact, it was banned as being anti-German, and it became a crime to even own the book. In 1929, Carl Laemmle at Universal bought the rights to the film and made it into a motion picture. It ended up being the first talkie, the first sound motion picture to win an Academy Award for Best Picture. At that time, the film was made for an astounding budget of $1.2 million, which, of course, now seems like nothing, but at the time that was a large budget for a film. The movie, by the way, had a budget of $20 million, which for a film of this scale is not much money. I think a lot of that was because the above the line was much more reasonable than it would have been with an American picture with known stars, but still the scale of what they did, and part of that they were able to achieve that because of where they shot in Prague. They had so many locations that were ideal for a period film. There are two writers, Leslie Patterson and Ian Stokell, that had been trying to get this picture made for 16 years. They bought an option on the book in 2006, and a lot of times options are 2 or 3 year options, but for this book it was a annual option renewal, which cost them between $10,000 and $15,000, so that they figured by the time that they actually made a deal to get the picture made, it had cost them around $200,000 in option money. In 2020, it was announced that the German director Edward Berger was going to be directing, and he signed on and immediately became an additional writer on the adaptation. He spent the rest of 2020 working on the picture, and then once they made the distribution deal with Netflix, went into it full bore. He ended up hiring a British cinematographer named James Friend that he had worked with several times before to shoot the picture. And they spent 2 months storyboarding all of the action sequences. And when you see the picture, they were very true to the storyboards. And once they'd storyboarded the picture to their satisfaction, the problem became where to shoot it. Through a lot of location scouting, they decided that the best place both for the look of the picture and for budget reasons, was in the Czech Republic around Prague. So most of the locations are in a range of about 50 miles from the center of Prague. The battlefield became a particular sticky subject because about half the movie takes place on the battlefield and in trenches. So it was very crucial they find just the right place for this scene. They finally found a defunct Soviet airfield called Bozidar, which is near a town called Milovice. The production designer Christian Goldbeck immediately had a lot of reservations about this location, primarily because, as you can see here in the foreground, it's a dead flat area. There's no terrain. And he didn't know how he was going to create any sort of texture to this, as well as hide the surrounding infrastructure from the airfield. They decided that what they would have to do is simply sculpt it. They would have to come in and not only dig the trenches themselves, but sculpt the battlefield, the shell holes, and create a berm around the perimeter of the airfield, of their area of the airfield they were using, as a visual block to not see the rest of the world outside of the battlefield area. To figure out the scale of the battlefield, the size of the trenches, the distance between the trenches, they would sometimes go through the scenes. They would read dialogue as they walked to figure out how long the trenches needed to be, or certain sections of the trenches needed to be. And then they would, Edward Berger, the director, decided how long of a take he wanted for some of these attack scenes. And they estimated how long of a distance they needed to create between both the French and the German trenches to be able to sustain this action over these long takes. The length of the battlefield ended up being 645 meters, or about 700 yards, which is, the equivalent of 7 American football fields. The German trenches were placed on the west side of the battlefield area, and the French trenches on the east. The cinematographer, James Friend, thought that this was really ideal from a camera's point of view, because this meant that you could shoot the French trenches in the morning and have the sun behind you, and then turn around and shoot the German trenches in the afternoon and evening and have the sun behind you as well, because they wanted to have a lot of rear light rather than it being front lit. Once they got down to designing the trenches, they realized that they had a little problem with trying to match to be historically accurate to the trench sizes. Most trenches of the period of World War I were not wide. They were actually meant to be as narrow as possible for protection for the troops inside the trenches from artillery. So the director had a very definite sense for how he wanted to follow the action inside the trenches. And it came down to what the camera crew needed to actually get the shot. They began to look at all their reference, and in their original designs, the DP and the camera crew looked at it, and they decided they just weren't wide enough for the equipment that they needed to use to get the shots. The picture was shot on 4 different cameras, mainly ARRIs. The ARRI Alexa 65 and the ARRI Mini LF were used for probably 90% of the picture. They also used the Sony Venice and a Red Weapon. And each of these cameras had their own special reasons for being used at various points in the picture. Here's a comparison of the 4 different sensors laid over top of each other. You can see that the largest sensor was the Alexa 65, which is comparable to a 65 millimeter film frame. The next is the Alexa Mini LF, and it is considered a large frame sensor, meaning that it's about the same size as a full frame still photography frame. Then there's the Sony Venice. It's a little bit wider than the Mini LF and not quite as vertical a frame. And then there's the Red Weapon, which is very comparable to the Alexa Mini LF. Here's all 4 of the frames that have been compressed to the same width. They basically took the footage in post and cropped all of the sensor frames to 2.39. Here's a list of all the focal lengths of the lenses that they used. You'll notice that they are spherical rather than anamorphic. Even though the picture is in an anamorphic ratio of 2.39, they decided to use spherical primes because of the weight, additional weight that they would have to incur because of using the anamorphic lenses. And because a lot of the shots are handheld, they wanted to try to get the camera weight down as much as possible. So they decided to use spherical, and they're using all primes. You notice there's no zoom lenses here. And in the angles of view column, you can see that the Alexa 65 will give you a wider angle of view than the Alexa Mini LF with the same lens. And that again is just because of the wider sensor. The Alexa 65 was primarily used for the landscape shots, for interior shots, the stage work, and it was used some during the battlefield scenes when the camera could either be mounted on the Technicrane or if it could be mounted on a dolly. There were numerous scenes during the battle for several attacks when they had dolly track laid parallel to the action, where they would follow along with the characters as they were attacking the French trenches. As long as they could get the camera on some sort of support system, they tried to shoot on the Alexa 65. Arri actually made the 18.5 focal length lens for them custom for the very opening scene of the battle, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You can see that it gives them an angle of view of 111 degrees, which is pretty wide. During the indoctrination scenes, where we see the lead character and his friends at school and when they are joining up the army, they shot these scenes on a 35 and a 40. So they still had pretty wide angle of views. They had 75 degrees with the 35 and 68 degrees with the 40. And then the shots in the town, and these were shot in Prague. And a lot of the locations. The wider lenses on the 65 also came into heavy use on the interiors, particularly of the general's quarters. The Arri Mini LF was the real workhorse of the picture, particularly all of the handheld shots that occur in the trenches and out of the trenches, back and forth across the battlefield. These were apparently shot mainly with a 27 and a 35, which on the Mini gave them angles of view of between 55 and 68. They were trying to get as wide a shot as possible without going too wide. They apparently had about 400 extras, and they were reluctant to go any wider than the 55 simply because they couldn't fill the frame with enough people, partly because the battlefield was so huge. Now, when they shot scenes of the battlefield with the 65, particularly these tracking shots running parallel to the battlefield, they had to go to a slightly longer lens to match the focal lengths that they were getting with the Alexa LF. So with the 65, they were going with a 40 mil and a 50 mil to get the same angles of view that they were with the 27 and the 35 mil on the Alexa Mini. For the night scenes, they went with the Sony Venice. And the reason why is most of the digital cinema cameras have a native ISO, which is their ideal sensitivity that they perform the best at. The Alexas have a native sensitivity of about 800. The Sony Venice has the advantage of it actually has dual native sensitivity, which is 800 on the low end. At the very sensitive end, it has an ISO of 2500, and that's about 2 stops more sensitive than the ARRIs. So for the night shots, they decided to go with the Sony Venice. So for the trench scenes and the battlefield scenes, they had to come up with a stabilization system because they wanted a lot of handheld shots. Now they tried to use a Steadicam, and they did use the Steadicam for some interior shooting. The problem with the battlefield and the trenches was because the ground is so uneven and so slick and sticky, it was just impossible to do it with a Steadicam. There was too much for the operator. So what they did is they ended up using a system that they used on the film 1917, and it is a system called the Stabili. And what it is a gimbal system with a hothead that can be mounted, as you see here, this is just mounted on a piece of speed rail on a piece of tube, and it can be carried by 1 or 2 people, and it has a head that sends a signal to the operator who is operating off-site. So they talked the production designer into widening the trench to allow for this camera system. But for the trench scenes, they got by with just having one person actually carrying the camera. Now, the crew isn't simply the guy carrying the camera. The camera operator, the first AC, is actually then operating the pan and tilt and the controls of the camera from another location. He is not operating it from inside the trench. So you have not only the grip carrying the camera with this hothead, but then you also have a sound man, a boom operator, a sound recordist, and you've also got the follow focus, the focus puller. So you've got to have, allow room for all those people to be able to navigate and be able to do their job while they're moving through following the actors in the scene. So they talked the production designer into widening the trench to allow for this camera system. They spent 2 months designing the trench system and the battlefield area, and then they would spend almost 3.5 months building and doing the excavation. They began work in January of 2021, and of course it snowed during that period. When they began to dig, they found that the soil on the site was mainly clay, which is not great for the look of the film, for camera, for things like creating explosions. Clay just doesn't look very interesting. I think the positive part of it being clay is they didn't have to worry about cave-ins as much as if they had been digging in an area with loose earth. There's a part of the French trench in which they had to reinforce with concrete for a scene in which a French tank actually runs over the top of the trench, and they obviously had to create a safer area for that, because if they had just had clay and the wood siding, it would have caved in. They had a team of 20 diggers working on the actual excavation, and then they had a construction crew of 150 people making the hoarding and putting in all of the wood and structural elements in the trench. Just for a comparison, I did a Civil War picture called The Free State of Jones a number of years ago, and we had to create a Confederate trench system for the beginning of the movie. And this trench was probably maybe a little more than a quarter of the size of the one that they built for All Quiet on the Western Front. And people underestimate how much work it is to create a trench. Initially you look at it and you think, well, it's just digging, but it's moving a lot of earth. In this case, one of the producers thought that he wanted to explore the possibility of, instead of digging, actually bringing dirt in and piling it up to create the trench rather than digging into the ground. And I did the calculations as far as how much earth that entailed bringing in, and it was going to be about 150 dump trucks worth of dirt that we were going to have to bring in and then also remove. And besides the dirt, we would have had to actually create an expanded road surface that would have been also had to be compacted to handle the weight of all those trucks. So what we ended up doing to save a little bit of money was we excavated the trenches, but only half as deep as we had normally planned to, and just piled up the dirt as much as we could to create as much height. We also had the advantage of we were creating gabions, which were filled with earth. We could create height with those as well. So our trench and surrounding battlefield were, a fraction of what they created. I just can't believe how much dirt they had to remove, because the production designer Christian Goldbeck mentioned that the dirt that was at the site really wasn't suitable. In an interview, he said that there's not 1 centimeter of ground in this whole battlefield area that hasn't had additional dirt added of a different kind. And I think he said they looked at 20 different kinds of dirt before they settled on the ones that looked good on camera. The crew had to work in snow conditions through a lot of the work. They also lost 2 weeks of time because someone discovered an unexploded piece of ordnance from World War II. Here's rainbirds for a scene when the young guys first get to the front and they climb down into the trench. It's pouring rain, so of course they have these rainbirds out, the effects guys, to create this torrential rain. And I'm imagining it's partially because of the earth having so much clay in it that it acts just like a swimming pool. And over the course of the day and the next day, it just kept piling up, and it got till apparently it was almost at waist level by the time they were done with the scene. They used a vehicle that ARRI developed called the Hexatron, which is an all-terrain four-wheeled vehicle that you can mount a Technocrane on. And it's a pretty slick device, but in this muddy clay, it was constantly getting stuck. And they realized that it was slowing them down, and they had to do something about it. And they just didn't have any great solutions. Apparently, there was one night in the second week that they were wrapping up, and a lot of them were getting in the van to go back to the hotel, and they didn't know where the cinematographer, James' friend, was. And they thought, well, maybe did he go back with someone else? And then someone heard someone yell, and they realized he was still on the battlefield, and he had gotten stuck in one of the shell holes and was literally up to his waist in mud. And they almost left him. And they commented that they don't know. They may have found him dead the next morning. It took several people to pull him out. So then they knew they had to do something. So what they ended up doing was they talked the production designer into creating 3 roads through the middle of the battlefield. So they had to take a break and bring in pressure rollers and roll different paths through the battlefield, basically just compacted as much as they could, and then covered it with dirt. So you can just make out the paths of where these rolled paths were. And even when you know you're there, that they are there when you're watching the film, there's a couple points when I can just make out a section that, oh yeah, that must be a piece of the road there. But it happened so fast that unless you know they're there and you're looking for them, you don't really notice it. I think of course Goldbeck was worried that they were going to be very obvious and make the battlefield look not natural. But I think they were able to hide them pretty well. When the scene opens, the camera is up high and comes down onto the battlefield, and then turns and moves along the earth close to the ground. But in this very beginning scene, they had a bit of a problem because the director wanted this very wide shot from up high looking down. Well, the thing is, they only had the ARRI vehicle with the Technocrane on it, and it could only reach as high as 50 feet off the ground. Now, this comes back to focal lengths and lenses. The problem was that the widest lens they had even when they shot on the 65, was a 27 millimeter lens. And now that gave them a 90-degree angle of view, which 90 degrees seems like a lot, but at 50 feet off the ground, it wasn't enough for the shot that he wanted. So to get this shot, they asked ARRI if they could come up with a wider lens for them. So they apparently pulled some parts and made an 18.5 millimeter focal length lens that would fit on the ARRI 65, and that gave them 111 degrees angle of view. And it doesn't seem like a lot of difference, but it made a huge difference in being able to get the shot that he wanted. So here's the shot as it's in the frame. And right here, the camera actually isn't at full height. And this is after it's come down through some clouds and some fog and smoke. And it's at this point where you can actually see what's going on. Now with the other lens that they had, this wouldn't have gotten them, the wide shot that he wanted. You can see here in the yellow, that's as wide as they could get with that 27 millimeter lens. But with the 18.5, they got this extra area. Here's the camera with the 18.5 at full height. This is as high and as wide as they could have gotten. But again, in the very beginning of the shot, you're going through fog and smoke, so you're losing some of that width, because it takes a while before you can actually get down and see clearly what's going on. So that's as wide of an area as they could get, unless they got a bigger crane, which just wasn't an option. So the camera starts up high and then comes down. Now, one thing that is a problem with the wide lenses a lot of times is you end up getting barrel distortion. If you look at this image, for instance, look at the center, it looks pretty flat, but as you look off to the left side and the right side, you'll notice that it seems to almost look like it's pushed away from the frame. It's there's almost a curvature to the earth, the part of the earth that you're seeing, and that's the wide angle lens that you're seeing. It's that barrel distortion, and you get it a little bit differently as the camera moves down and glides along the earth. Here you can see, if you look here at this guy laying here on the right side of the frame, it looks like his face is flat. Looks like his head has actually been smashed. And that's caused by the distortion from the wide angle lens. That's just an artifact of the optics of something that wide, and there's nothing you really do about it. And I know they weren't really thrilled about that, but it's not something you really notice unless you're kind of attuned to look for it. So once the camera moves down into the trench, it settles on a young soldier, and it kind of is set up to make you believe that this is the main character of the story. So you watch him slowly crawl out of the trench as part of this attack, and he's running across the battlefield. And then soon you see him among a pile of bodies in the rear area where they have drugged the casualties to be buried. And this is the beginning of a visual sequence, a process where you see the factory-like activities that go on to basically the soldiers are stripped of their uniforms. Any usable items, any usable parts of the uniforms are piled and assembled into separate groups, and then they are shipped to the rail yard. Here you see the rail yard where they're both shipping wounded soldiers back to field hospital, as well as shipping these items of clothing and equipment back to the rear to be processed. And this is one of a very similar shot that gets repeated throughout the film. The director, Edward Berger, loves these real symmetrical, very straight on, very long shots where they basically vanish off into the horizon. So you see the uniforms being loaded onto this train car. And then it picks it up here at a factory where they are processed. There's a lot of nice shots here, very contrasty, very dark foregrounds and lit backgrounds. Again, one of those symmetrical shots. And here they are taking the uniforms and basically washing the mud and the blood off of them. A real nice backlit shot. And it's really just these two shots that constitute that part of the scene, even though here's the location. You can see that the set decorator had to decorate a really large part of this room. And again, I always say they never see 70% of what we do sometimes, and this is, I guess, a good example of that. And here is the factory where the young women are sewing and repairing all of the uniforms. They're patching bullet holes, they're patching rips and tears and trying to bring them into as new a condition as possible. And this is one of those set decoration challenges. It's one thing to come up with a 100-year-old working treadle powered sewing machine, and it's something else to come up with 100 of them. It's the problem we always have with hardware. Sure, I can go out and take a picture and maybe find a doorknob set that looks similar to the one in this photograph, but what happens if I need 30 of them? So here's the set. You can see, and I just, it's amazing to me she found so many of these treadle powered machines that were still in operating condition. And you'll start to notice throughout this series of stills, which you can see here, is the area outside the window is completely blown out. There's not a scene in the movie except for actually some stage work where you can actually see anything outside that window, outside any of the windows in any of the sets. So there's no backings used at all. In one of the stage sets where we'll look at the trains, they had 2 LED walls that they used to create atmosphere outside the train windows. But at the actual locations and some of the rear area buildings that they created behind the battlefield area, whenever you're inside and you see a window, it's always going to be blown out. Here's one of the real nice landscape shots that they pull off throughout the movie. And usually the action in a lot of these shots is always moving directly, either right to left or left to right. Here's a scene where Paul, the main character, is riding his bike to school, and these were shot in Prague. And these are the more colorful saturated scenes in the film. As the film goes on, it will slowly become more and more monochromatic. And here's our lead character and his friends going off to the school for this meeting with the headmaster. And here in the foreground, soldiers are unloading these reconditioned uniforms that you've been seeing worked on earlier in the scene. Here's the empty classroom. Again, blown out windows. You really can't see what's going on outside. Another one of these side lit, dead on shots looking off directly into a vanishing point. So here's the scene with the headmaster who is getting these young guys whipped up to enlist and join the army. These were shot with the Alexa 65 and again mainly with the 35 and 40 millimeter lenses. Although they did use a type of lens called the Alexa signature lens, which the DP liked because it had a little softer look than the lenses that they used for the battle scene sequences. Here's a fairly long depth of field, and as you get into the scene, the depth of field becomes narrower and narrower. Until you see Paul in focus in the foreground. You know, maybe 2 foot depth of field here. His friends are out of focus behind him. And then it cuts to the headmaster, who again is in sharp focus, and the rest of the professors and teachers behind him are out of focus. The scene was pretty much lit from a window off to the left side there of the frame, and some lights that they were able to squeeze into the area above the skylight, directly above. So it was pretty tricky to light, and luckily they had those very sensitive digital sensors in the Alexa cameras. Here's the indoctrination where they're lining up to have their papers checked and to get their uniforms. And they lit this the same way. The area above the skylight, they managed to squeeze some fabric balloons in to create a nice soft light. And the same with this scene. When you look at the windows, you really can't discern any detail out of the windows. And this is a type of shot I don't know if I've seen before, but it's interesting. Instead of the camera focusing on the subject, on the actor, and following focus with him as he steps up on the platform, the focus is actually set to the final point where the actor is going to end up in the shot. So he literally walks into focus. And then you see the officer look at his papers and hands him a uniform, and as he hands it to him, he tears off the name tag, which they forgot to remove at the factory, hands him his uniform, and then you see the name tag drop to the floor, and this is the name tag of the soldier that you see in the very beginning of the movie who's killed. And this is one of those really nice, they just work at various points in the movie, really nice, very extreme close-ups of objects or things that are either have been an integral part of the story or that are a nice shadowing device or are simply a thematic image. As far as stage sets, they didn't seem to do that much work on stage. Most of it was done in the battlefield or in exterior locations or in other locations where they were using practical interiors. The bulk of the stage work seems to be the scenes that take place on the trains, both the armistice train where they signed the papers of surrender and the train that the German delegates are staying in during the negotiation process. I know that the production company wanted them to use one of the real trains that they had rented that they used for the exterior shots, but the DP and the director and the production designer all balked at this for a variety of reasons. For one thing, the shots that the director wanted to get were in some cases unshootable in the real trains, and I'll talk about that. So they shot at Barrandov Studios outside Prague, and the train sets, as far as I can tell, were on stage 4. And this is one of the older stages. It's an all-wood stage. I think some of the walls, the lower walls, are concrete, but the upper structure and ceiling are all wood. And it's actually not a very big stage. It's not quite 100 feet long and not quite 60 feet wide. It had a 34-foot perms to the perms, so it had plenty of headroom because they weren't building anything that tall. They squeezed as much scenery onto that stage as they could, it looks like. So here's a plan view of the armistice train. And these are the LED walls on either side. So they gave themselves a little more room here at the ends of the table than existed in the actual train. And they also changed the seating order. There originally, in the original train, there were 4 seats on each side and then 1 chair at each end for the interpreters. And I believe they decided that visually it was obstructive to have someone sitting at the end of it, either end of the table. They built 2 LED walls on either side of the set itself. And because the set was so small, I believe that they redressed the set from one setting to another. They went from the German delegates' car to the armistice car. And the DP and his crew shot plates with some actors in French military costume standing in the woods just to give it a little bit of life. And then those were just mirrored and projected onto both of those walls during the filming. They extended the width of the car slightly, but in looking at it, it doesn't seem like they took too many liberties. It is still fairly narrow which is true to most of the train cars at the time's width, which was about 9'10" for this type of car. So it didn't give them a lot of room to maneuver. Most of the shots are straight on from one end of the car or the other. There are some shots taken from the side, some over the shoulders, and if you look at the stills a little bit, you can see that they have worked in wide joints in the paneling of the cars. And when you look out the windows, you can make out the plates on the LED walls outside the windows. And as I mentioned before, this is one of the few sets when you actually see any kind of detail when you look out a window. But shooting on stage gave them the ability to actually have much more freedom to light it. Not only to be able to shoot it, but to light it as well. It would have been pretty difficult to convert that car to a believable, smoking lounge or private car without an incredible amount of work, and it wouldn't be an overnight affair. That may have been something in their decision to shoot on stage also, is that they tend to underestimate how long it's going to take to dress out a practical vehicle. They seem to think it's just a matter of bringing in some furniture and some lights, and obviously it's a lot more work than that. Here's one of the shots, over-shoulder shots, that would not have been possible on the real train. So let's examine a worst-case scenario. Let's say that the producers pushed them to shoot inside the actual car. Maybe not just this car, but the actual car, which is now in a museum. Let's assume a worst-case scenario where you're on a production and they don't have the money to build a set of the train car, much less rent the stage. So you have to shoot this car. Here's some shots of the inside of the actual car. It seems really spacious, and that's only because these are shot with a really wide lens, which once again is famous for being deceptive. It's why when you look at real estate photos of houses, you can tell they're always shot with really wide angle lens to make the room and the house seem much bigger than it actually is. So immediately you can see you have the problem of this glass partition wall, which is much closer to the table than the partition wall is on the set. Here's from outside one of the other chambers looking into the signing room, and this one isn't quite as wide a lens, so immediately you can see that the space inside is really, it's not that big. Here is the plan views of both the stage set and the actual or replica Armistice car set. And so you can see that there is not even close to being the space at either end of the table that there is in the set. For the over-the-shoulder shots, your only choice is to shoot through the window glass, which you you may have to make that work. The director may have to just accept that look, although you have to, if it's a day shot, put in some kind of reflection on that glass of the woods that are on either side of the train. And then for the same thing with the other side, I guess you'd have to put up a green screen and light it and comp in the woods later. This is a shot from the film looking over Erzberger's shoulder, looking at the surrender papers. This would be pretty much impossible shooting in that real car unless you shot with a really small camera, and you just wouldn't have the look that you have with Ariflex. Here's a shot when he's inside his cabin, and again, this high shot, the ceiling would be in the way. This would not be a shot you'd be able to get, at least not this wide. Here's in the German delegate's car. Again, this is a shot would be impossible to get inside that real car, much less the fact of trying to dress it out to look like this. Another shot they would have had to wild out part of the wall to get. Here's a shot over the shoulder of the last German field marshal to sign the papers. Again, this would have been pretty impossible with the Airy. And then this shot of the surrender papers being passed from General Foch to Erzberger. This overhead shot, definitely impossible to do without the set. And this was on a 40, which meant that camera would have had to be above the ceiling. And of course, in the set, they could remove that ceiling piece to be able to light it. They could put a big silk up there and get a nice soft light from up above. So it would have been impossible to get this shot in that actual car. The camera just couldn't get high enough to get both the men in. Other than the work in the battlefield area and the scenes that they shot on the soundstage, they used a number of actual locations during the film. For the headquarters scene, they shot at a location called Castle Sykrov, or Sykrov, depending on your pronunciation. This castle is up in the northern Czech Republic. It was owned by a French aristocratic family that had been expelled from France during the French Revolution in the early 1800s. And they bought this property. And then in the mid-1800s, they proceeded to develop it further and renovate it and gave it a very neo-Gothic feel on both the exterior and the interior. And this worked out for the film, which in the story takes place in Belgium and France. So it was a much more French style of architecture than a lot of the other Eastern European architecture that they found in the other locations. Here's a shot that, again, framed up in a preference for the director in a very centered, symmetrical, vanishing point effect. And you see he's moving, the one deputy is moving through the rooms, and you can see a lot of the really nice neo-Gothic architecture here. A lot of really beautiful Gothic panel details, which, if you had to recreate this set on a soundstage, would be pretty expensive. You could do, of course, all of this panel molding with a CNC, but this was all most likely done with hand molding planes. And the decoration above the wainscot which looks like Lincrusta, is actually most likely what Lincrusta was made to simulate, which is hand-tooled leather. This is the other large chateau they used. This was the general's headquarters in the film. This is the Zamek Horen Chateau, which is north of Prague. It was built in the early 1700s and then had heavy renovation done toward the end of the 18th century. One nice thing about the layout of the chateau is because it had the main building and then the wings, it visually cuts off anything other than what's inside the area between the buildings, other than what's above the roof line. The chateau actually is, I believe it's been taken over by the state. They're hoping someone would turn it into something like a luxury hotel. It has a lot of amazing 18th century detail, but of course a renovation would be really expensive. A lot of beautiful plaster faubois. Of course, it had a family chapel, as was the case in a lot of those large European chateaus. They obviously chose the areas of the chateau which had not suffered either water damage or atmospheric damage, such as in this case where the parquet floor is pretty intact. Same thing with the wall detail. And they just dressed out those areas. This was the general's dining quarters. But shooting at this location, they were able to achieve a lot of depth that would have been difficult and expensive to do with a stage set. There was some VFX work done. They created a lot of damage on the roof areas and blew out some of the windows. This damage is also visual effects, CG effects. Here's a big CG scene. In this scene, they actually took all of their extras that they had available and put them on the right side of the frame and then moved all of them over to the left side of the frame and then married the shot. When you look outside the gates, you're looking into empty countryside, when actually at the actual location, out the gates is a modern street and a whole modern village. So that had to be painted out in CG as well. The insides of the chateau were shot mainly with existing light, window light, and as with pretty much all of the other interiors in the film, they didn't have any qualms about blowing out the window area. So in pretty much every shot, you really don't see anything outside the window in the terms of detail. For the night shots, they installed kinos above the frame line where they wouldn't be seen, and then above in the center of the rooms, in the two main rooms, they have coupes or big soft boxes that created the general soft illumination to simulate the candlelight in the room. There are quite a few scenes in the general's dining area where he has meals with his adjutant. And there's one particular scene toward the end of the movie as the war is winding down and they realize that a peace treaty is going to be signed. and they're having dinner, and the general's asking his adjutant what he's going to do after the war. And within their conversation, both the verbal exchanges and the visual exchanges and the visual framing, you get an idea of how deep this gulf is between them, not only rank-wise, but socially and intellectually. And so they're seated across each other in this long table. It's I'm guessing it's somewhere between 14 and 16 feet long. And there was one particular shot that the director really wanted, was this straight-on shot from the side of the table with them both in the frame. And the problem they had, which is, sometimes always the problem when you're working at a real location, is you can't get the camera where you can get everything in shot that you want in shot. In this instance, they were shooting this on the Arri 65, the 65 equivalent sensor. So it's a big sensor. That helped get the wide shot, but the problem was the widest lens they had was a 27, and the 27 millimeter just wasn't long enough. I wasn't able to get any actual drawings to work off of, so this is all from scaling photographs of the actual chateau, the exterior, and scaling from photographs, both production stills and freeze frames from the film itself. But I think I'm pretty close. So this is the scene that he wanted, but with the Arri 65 with the widest lens they had, which was a 27, that's all they could get. They couldn't really get both men in frame from a straight on from the side. So they ended up incorporating the 18.5 wide lens that Arri had put together for them for the very opening scene of the film, when they couldn't get the shot that as wide of a shot as they wanted for that opening sequence. And I know you can see some room between the back of that camera and the wall. For one thing, this is not in correct scale as far as the camera, and you've got to get the camera and the operator and so on and so on. So I don't know exactly if I've got this room correct. All I know is that camera would have had to be inside the wall or beyond the wall to get the shot that they wanted with that 27 millimeter lens. So here is the shot with the 18.5. There are a couple scenes that they shot actually on the location at the battlefield in the trenches that they had to come up with some kind of clever solutions. One is toward the latter part of the film, and the Germans have invaded and taken over the French trench. And they're going through the trench trying to eliminate or kill all of the French soldiers that are still that hadn't managed to escape. And they find that they have found the French pantry where the cook normally is preparing all the meals. And they're seeing all this food when they've been eating not much. And they are gorging on all of the sausage and bread that they're finding. And then they start to hear this rumble. And it cuts to a very low shot of this army of rats that come out from the woodwork, and they're just fleeing and running out of the trench. And so it's this ominous feeling of this being the rat. Even the rats know that whatever is coming is worse than they want to experience and try to hide from. So this shot is a particularly low shot. It's the center, the axis of the lens is almost at the level of the rats. It's only about 3 inches off the floor level. And whenever you're doing a really low angle shot like this, it's always a good reason to build a set on a platform. And of course, this is, in a trench. And so there aren't any wild walls. There isn't any floor to remove. So there are a couple different ways they could have gotten this shot. This is called a low angle prism. And it's been around for quite a while. It's nothing new. And it's basically a mirrored prism that you attach to the front of the camera. It changes the angle of the light coming into the lens by 90 degrees. So you can literally get it down near the floor. And it gives you the illusion of the lens being 3 or 4 inches off of the floor or whatever it is you're trying to get a shot of. The problem with these is when you are trying to use it in a situation like the trenches, where you have a lot of dirt and you have smoke elements and you have a lot of particulate in the area. You have all these different surfaces on this prism that you have to prevent from getting dust and dirt and, all kinds of particulate that are going to show up as big dust spots on the image. Now you could also in this situation use what's called a periscope lens. And this is an attachment that attaches to the front of the camera. And it has a smaller optical lens elements on the front of it. So you're not using a normal lens and attaching something to that lens. It's actually replacing the lens that you would normally use. And the advantage of that is you can get into tight spaces, as you see here. You can put an element that changes, like the prism, it to a 90 degree angle. It can, in some instances, give you a lot more depth of field than a normal lens. Again, it has, it can have issues. It may have been something so simple that they, dropped it on a sandbag and laid the camera right on the floor. They may have had to dig part of the floor out to get the camera low enough. But the other problem they would have had to work out is the angle of view of the lens. Was the lens wide enough? The French pantry was shot in a portion of the French trench. And that's this area in yellow that you see here. So it was built into the set. They always, all along, planned to shoot it there. So without any wild walls, they were pretty limited as to what they could or couldn't get in the frame. And that was based on the wide angle lenses that they had in their kit. So from the layout of the room, it looks like the camera was about right there. That's as far back as they could get and get everything into frame. And it looks like it was either a 35 or a 40 mil on that Arri 35. There's only one area in the trench set that I've been able to find where they had any kind of wild wall, and that would be on the rear side of the radio room, which is located around the middle of the trench. There's several scenes in here, mainly from back inside looking out into the main trench itself. And it's unclear from these pictures how deep that room is, but when you look at some of the photographs from Ernestine Hipper, the set decorator, she took a lot of stills before they started shooting. And in the ones I found of the radio room, it only looks like it's about 8 feet deep to that back wall. So it's not deep enough to be able to get a camera back in there to get that shot. I mean, you could maybe frame in the doorway, but there's no way you would be able to see all the rest of this this area of the room unless it was a really long lens, or wide lens, which I know they didn't have. So here's the German trench, and when I kept looking at it to figure out where this would be, I figured out that that radio room is right here. And if you look on that back wall, you can just make out the fact that there's a wild wall there. Here's the model of the trench of that area. And it looks like that that whole area from front to back is open. So here's the area where that wild wall would be. And there is approximately the size of the built set, which would have had a wild wall along that back wall. So I'm guessing this is about a 47mm lens on that Alexa 65. The other area of the German trench that they took advantage of the fact that it was so large is they decided to make one end of the trench be the area of the trench during the scene when there is an artillery bombardment and one of the dugouts is destroyed. It's always tricky to redress a set depending on if you're trying to make a set look suddenly older or newer, or have it have a lot of damage, and then if you have to then turn it back and have it be undamaged. And with this kind of set with a trench, the fact that it's actually dug into the earth, it makes it a little difficult to pull that off. And I think what they did was really smart. They simply took an end of the trench and made it look post-bombardment as if it's already destroyed. And then they tied it in to the only part of the trench scenes that I think was shot on stage. I think it was just this one bunker scene that they actually shot on stage. Here you can see some of the lighting, the soft boxes they have set up, and you can just see the back wall of the part of the trench they built to be outside the bunker. Here's the interior of that set, the director and DP discussing some of the shots. And then this is the scene itself where the bombardment started, and they've all piled into this bunker. And it's starting to shake, and they're getting a lot of artillery rounds hit very close. And then finally, at one point, it caves in. And they do a real clever in-camera effect for the cave-in without having to go to crazy extremes, but it's very effective and it's completely believable, and it's just in camera in front of the lens. And then it cuts to an area of the exterior trench where they are digging out the guys that are hopefully still alive. And then our main character is seen staggering through what's left of the trench.